My name is Regina McCarthy. I live in Franklin Park and one of your
resident of Pine Township
I wish
and
I
one of
could
your
have met with you many
constituents. I tried to meet with you 12
I've called your
times.
office.
I also
I'm afraid
believe
we
that
haven't had an opportunity to meet, but although I've been to your office
I live in
Madison
Madison
Township,
and I'm one of your
I want you to
constituents.
know
All
how important this issue is.
regardless of where we
Really
live,
what it is, I
need
think,
to
is a
have
c-
fair
citizens
elections.
Does this body believe the state constitution? Does it believe that we, the people, have the right to alter and reform our government? Or does this body represent the party leadership who say no? That's the question, and we're waiting to find out. So thank you.
Since 2016, Fair Districts PA has worked tirelessly with legislative allies to get meaningful gerrymandering reform passed in Harrisburg. In the 2017-2018 session, House Bill 722 had more co-sponsors from both parties than any other bill. Unfortunately, a single politician was able to prevent the bill from coming up for a vote by exploiting procedural rules that place too much power in the hands of a few leaders, denying all Pennsylvanians fair districts and fair elections. Join us as we examine roadblocks to reform and show how engaged voters can make all the difference.
We tried many different avenues to get that bill discussed. We tried to show bipartisan support across the state. We had 38 Republican co-sponsors when we were at our 110 co-sponsor level. We tried to have, we respectfully asked for a hearing. I sent a letter, a bipartisan letter to the chair of the committee. He has not answered the letter. It's been over 15 months and 14 months, and he still has not even answered a letter written by 3 of his colleagues. And Representative Delisio was one of the ones who co-signed that letter. We tried a discharge resolution. There's a procedure where the House can try to discharge a bill out of committee over the objections of a chairperson. That was stymied twice. We tried that with House Bill 722, and also Representative Nielsen from Philadelphia tried it on a companion bill. He had the Fair Districts 2016 proposal. We tried to get that one out of committee, but both times the chair of that committee decided to amend the bill and then hold on to it in the committee. So those bills never were released to the full House floor. So we're talking about rules because we think our rules need some amendments.
I can't think of a less sexy political issue than inside baseball.
We're going to talk a little bit, and I'm really grateful for everyone being here and really grateful for the stories, because what I was charged to discuss is the arcane rules of the House. And I'm just telling everybody this is not the most scintillating topic that you have ever encountered.
But the reality is, and you saw it firsthand with your efforts to try to get a bill out of Metcalfe's committee, without rules changes, without a single committee chair having so much power, even if 100% of the people of Pennsylvania were for something, one lone committee chair could kill that idea, could kill that bill.
And by the way, when I say leadership, who am I talking about? I'm talking about 3 people: the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the committee chair. Any one of those 3 people can stop action on a piece of legislation. So what the rules do is they empower one person to speak for 12.5 million people in Pennsylvania. That's not right.
And nothing ever happens. The bill that we were supporting on redistricting reform, 110 co-sponsors, most of any in this session, and the committee chair said, we're not going to talk about that. So when the prime sponsor attempted a discharge petition, which is a procedural rule to get a bill moved out of committee so it gets heard, he took the bill, called a committee meeting with less than 24-hour notice, didn't announce the agenda, and then handed out at the meeting an amendment to the amendment that completely gutted the amendment and put something completely different in place.
And I think the best way to make sure we have a citizens actually being the ones redrawing, citizens who are held accountable to their fellow citizens who elect them to office, and that they're not just going to go away after the work is done, that they can be accountable in the future for their decisions, is to totally gut and replace this bill with the amendment that is now before us, and it was just explained by Michael.
No one had time to read it. No one had time to discuss it.
Not in agreement with the amendment currently before us. As the minority chair stated, it was put here, and I'm a fast reader, but nobody could be that fast.
They voted for the amendment, but then they didn't vote on the bill. So it never moved out of committee, never went back to the floor to be changed. And that's okay, according to our Pennsylvania state legislature.
As I was saying about the accountability and transparency of this committee and what a legislative body brings to bear on this issue, I would note House Bill 722, the underlying legislation, has never been given an opportunity for hearing. And I think there is much to be discussed on House Bill 722. It proposes to amend our Constitution. And I would also note that now we have an amendment to said bill without a hearing. But let me tell you, the citizens of Pennsylvania, you're not the only ones who've never seen this amendment. I've never seen this amendment. The minority party has never seen this amendment. We propose today to amend the Constitution. The majority would hoist upon the minority an amendment that has never been seen by the minority. You see what that looks like. That doesn't look like transparent and accountable. I would say to the majority, this is not worthy of an amendment to the state constitution.
You got to recognize that Harrisburg has a top-down leadership-driven system. And that first vote that you make, you give the power to the speaker. So even though he only represents the same number of people as you, he has the power to control the agenda.
In fact, we've started studying the way our government, our local government, our state government works. At the request of some past legislators who said, you need to understand how procedural rules work, how procedural rules are put in place, and how they impact what happens in Harrisburg. Procedural rules are voted on the first day of each session. So they could be changed. They're not in the Constitution, they're not in law, they're simply voted on the first day of each session.
What we've just heard is how the unfair procedural rules, which were voted on the very first day, 1 minute after you're sworn in, and you've heard the stories of how much you might or might not know as a new legislature about that, then affect the entire governorship of the legislature and who has power.
And so procedural rules are tweaked session by session, and if the people who tweak them are gradually putting more and more power in the hands of less and less people, then your representatives have less and less say about the things that matter to you.
It's really not about the parties, but it's about the process and what voices get heard and what issues get discussed and what issues die in committee, which is exactly what we had happen with Bill 722 that Carol discussed.
There's a really important study done last year by Catherine Gale and Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School, Why Competition in the Politics Industry is Failing America. And they talk about the duopoly, the two-party duopoly that thrives on a narrative of division, of saying they're the enemy, they're the ones who are doing it wrong, and waving flags, and each side has their flag that they wave to get people angry and to get people to vote the way they want them to vote. And there's a lot of money in this. They call it the political industrial complex. And they talk about the money that's there and the reasons that political industrial complex wants to keep the current structures in place. There's a lot of power, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of influence for both sides. But as people, we pay the cost. Devastating implications for citizens, divisive rhetoric, gridlock, unfulfilled promises, no attempt at solutions, incentives not to solve problems, because once you figure out a reasonable solution, you can't wave that flag anymore, so you don't want to do that. You want to just keep accusing the other side. No accountability, and no countervailing forces to restore healthy competition.
So I wanted to show you this map. This is a map that comes from the Fair Vote and Bipartisan Policy Center, and they talk about agenda setting, and they've created a fairness index. So take a look at Pennsylvania. We're 0% for fairness. That's us.
There's just a handful of states that have 100%. And one of the reasons I was interested in this is we were told when we started, no state legislature is ever going to put in place redistricting reform. The legislators are not going to give it up. They're not going to give up that power. And yet in Colorado this year, there was a redistricting reform constitutional amendment that passed in Colorado and went to referendum. And I thought, how did that happen? Well, Colorado has 100% agenda fairness. Pennsylvania has a 0% agenda fairness. And the way it played out in Colorado, 3 legislators on April 18th introduced 2 constitutional amendments. 3 legislators, they didn't get lots of co-sponsors, they didn't have a lot of public attention. They just introduced these 2 constitutional amendments. They immediately were scheduled for consideration in committee 2 weeks later. April 5th, April 7th, those constitutional amendments were considered in committee. They were amended on the 5th. There was another small amendment on the 7th. They were immediately scheduled for vote on both the House and Senate floor. On May 16th, they were both voted unanimously by the state legislature. It took them 4 weeks. 4 weeks without public pressure, without outcry, without press. 4 weeks. That's what agenda fairness looks like. A good idea, a reasonable solution. It's given a hearing, it's given a vote. It went to referendum, passed with 71% of the vote. That's the difference.
This past year, I've been among many complaining about Darrell Metcalf, chair of the House State Government Committee. And despite all the momentum built up for redistricting reform, mostly because of the efforts of Fair Districts PA, he kept these bills buried, and when other legislators like Steve Samuelson tried to pry them from his clutches, he amended them into unrecognizability with the cooperation of all the committee's Republicans. Metcalf is one of a kind, luckily. But his obstruction still had a Groundhog Day quality for me, because I spent a lot of time in 2008 railing about another chair of the State Government Committee, Democrat Babette Joseph. She actually told me she wouldn't let the redistricting reform bill she was burying come to a vote because she was afraid it would lose. She insisted she wanted reform. I think she was a co-sponsor, actually, but she told me, I don't want to put up a bill that very likely might not pass. How would that help? So the time expired and nothing happened. What really was happening, I knew, was that party leaders still like things the way they were, just as they do today in Pennsylvania. Bad government truly is bipartisan.
So here's the problem. Leaders draw the districts. The distorted districts protect the incumbents. The incumbents with seniority control the rules. They put in place unfair procedural rules that block reform. And so then they continue to draw the districts, and it's a recurrent cycle, or what I would call a tight knot of dysfunction. And the only way we break the tight knot of dysfunction is public outcry, public attention, public fury, and an insistence that those legislators who refuse to move change will eventually be voted out. It might take a long time to get the public aware enough and attentive enough, but we have to break this because they're not necessarily going to voluntarily break it on their own. And it's interesting, there are many legislators who would like to change this and who have said, we can't do this. The pressure has to come from outside this building because the legislators inside the building, if they're not committee chairs, if they don't have the seniority, they have no say. They have no way to impact it.
We got up to 110 co-sponsors. That's 55% of the House. One of only 2 bills in the entire session. We had about 2,400 bills, 2,500 bills. Only 2 bills were sponsored by a majority of representatives. In 55%, 110 sponsors, I thought, well, at least we're going to get some discussion, we're going to get some movement, we're going to get some action on this bill. As you may know, it was introduced on May 8th of 2017, and it was stuck in committee for 18 months and 22 days until it also it went away at midnight last night. All legislation in the session ended on November 30th. We have to start again in January. Why don't we talk about a proposal that if a bill gets a majority of the House members as co-sponsors, why not bring that to the floor for a vote, at least for consideration?
Kinds of modest rules changes that Steve and Pam and Bob and a lot of people have been talking about lately would go a long way in restoring some of that strength of democracy to the people's will. But there are problems with accompany that. And one is that the media normally doesn't care about that because it is inside baseball. It's hard to get excited about changing the mundane rules of how the process of the House of Representatives operates. But if you sense the reality that is affected, and I don't care if it's a gerrymandering issue or if you're concerned about the environment or if you're concerned about the undue influence of money in politics or any of the reform issues that Bill has written about over the years, you can't even get to that point most of the time unless the rules are more equitable and empowering to all of the legislators.
So you say, why is this all so important? Well, I think we realized over the last few years why redistricting, something that sounds very esoteric, is very important. But the rules of the House are equally important to the House, because the House and our legislative bodies, we have an overall democracy, but the legislatures are a democracy within a democracy. You don't get anything done in the legislature if you don't get a majority of the folks in the legislature to go along with what you want to do. Okay, so those rules are fundamentally important to the fairness of the chamber.
This is all man-created. It's been 150 years of fine-tuning how a few people. Remember, when they're talking about the budget, they're working on the budget. It's basically probably 3 people from each caucus. 12 men and the governor are deciding what happens, and then they come in and they say, this is what we're going to do.
For too long, policies supported by a majority of Pennsylvanians, common sense solutions that would benefit us all, have been blocked and stalled by special interests and partisan leaders.
Since I've been working on this, I've come across many, many, many policy issues that you would think simple economics would say this should be fixed. This is expensive not to fix. It's costing us a great deal to leave this unresolved, and yet these things go unresolved. And in each session, there are really good bills introduced. There are great people in our state legislature who would love to fix these things for the people of Pennsylvania. They introduce bills that go nowhere. So lead poisoning. I stumbled across this one and was really stunned. We have 18 cities in Pennsylvania that have higher levels of lead exposure than Flint, Michigan. And by a lot. This isn't just a little bit more, this is by a lot more. And in Flint, Michigan, the lead is in the water, so you can get around that by buying bottled water. In Pennsylvania's cities, the lead is in the air. You can't get around it by buying bottled air. So states around us that have aging housing have enacted policies that require mandated lead testing of children at certain ages and then mandated remediation, because they found that every dollar invested in lead hazard control results in a societal savings of as much as $221. How they got that exact number, I don't know. But when you think, a kid who gets lead poisoning, the brain damage that results is going to need extensive medical care the rest of their lives. They will never be a productive member of our communities. They will never be able to work. Their families will struggle to care for them all of their lives. It's a huge, huge cost. Wouldn't it make sense to figure out where that's happening and to solve it? And every session, there are legislators from those cracked out little communities, those cracked out cities like Allentown, who introduce legislation, and it doesn't even move out of committee.
Our economy has been harmed. Our communities have been harmed. We, the people of Pennsylvania, have been harmed. Pennsylvania has become an outlier in ways that carry a heavy economic and social cost. We have one of the most inequitable school funding models and some of the most underfunded school districts in the nation. We have the largest per capita population of juvenile offenders serving life sentences without parole in the world at a heavy cost with no public benefit.
I've got an old campaign card, which is now nearly 30 years old since I got elected for the first time in 1990. And the issues on the 4 major issues on that campaign card are still relevant today, particularly the one about adequate and equitable school funding, because they've never been adequately addressed by the legislature. And part of the reason for that is the system of control and the system of rules.
The list of unjust and economically unsound policies is long and growing longer every year. How did it happen that the state with the first free library does not ensure that elementary schools in our poorest communities have school libraries? How did it happen that a state with a rich history of higher education now spends more on imprisoning our young adults than on educating them for productive futures? How, in a state founded on Penn's vision of brotherly love, common good, and mutual regard, can we allow our legislative leaders to stir division between East and West, urban and rural, children and aging property owners, immigrants and the communities that benefit from new markets and new workers? How did a state that was once the example of representation fall so far behind in election provisions that ensure full electoral participation?
Money from special interests, that funds campaigns. You may have noticed already that there are no limits to campaign contributions in Pennsylvania. And you're not likely to see legislation that would change that anytime soon. That means that leadership has a great deal of money to help people in their party get elected. They also have complete control of those legislators' budgets after they get elected. A legislator has a district office, but the rent on that district office and the utilities on that district office and the salaries of all the office workers are paid for by the Democratic or Republican caucus. And one of the ways that our colleagues were threatened when they stood up, people with more seniority and more prospects, shall we say, when they stood up for rules reform, leadership told them, you're going to lose all your office staff if you make this vote. And they didn't give in, but it was a real serious threat.
I really believe as a Republican that good government should not be a partisan issue. And unfortunately, I think that one of the byproducts of this partisan setup we've set up in the legislatures is the fact that the people from the far right and the people from the far right tend to believe that the ends justify the means, okay? And they can play with the rules and play with the process so they get what they get in the end. And I just don't think that's fundamentally right.
And in a state as large as Pennsylvania, most political science experts will tell you that the larger the chamber, the more power becomes centralized in the hands of a few. That has happened in Pennsylvania. And those leaders' power is unbridled.
So the speaker, the majority leaders want to protect and elect their party members. And they can compel disciplined party voting, and you've heard from our past legislature some of the ways. We all know they can gerrymander districts. We've been hearing that all morning. They also control the agenda, so they block your bill, put you on a good committee, not on a good committee. They also control the campaign support as well as what was being discussed about your office and your office staff. So what can we do? So here's a couple things. Not everybody's like us. Actually, a lot of states have dealt with this. There's plenty of understanding of what to do. The first one is a rule that a committee has to hear a bill. If the bill comes to the committee, they actually have to vote on it.
If you go to the Pennsylvania State Legislature, I haven't been in the House for a while, but they have two big electronic boards where you can see how people vote. All the Republicans on our one board, and all the Democrats are on another. Okay, so if you're the sole Republican voting against something, and all your fellow Republicans are voting for it, there's a huge just a peer pressure to go along with your own party. And my idea is, why don't we just do it alphabetically? So you can't just look up there and just say whether I have to be with all my Republican Party colleagues or all my Democratic colleagues. So if I can put in my pitch for my rule of reform.
And there are also some that have to do with if you have a bipartisan list of 25 Republicans, 25 Democrats on a bill, that bill can't be bottled up by a committee chairman. They at least have to bring it up for a vote. So basically, there are a number of ways to streamline the process, even allow every member to have at least one designated bill that could be brought up for a vote.
Alan has really said it, but it's the automatic calendar for me that ensures every legislator to introduce a bill that has at least some modest bipartisan support, to see that bill have a committee hearing and a hearing on the floor.
Other rules include letting the majority of committee members or majority add agenda items or members to the floor. And all of this was part of GAVEL, an acronym I love, give a vote to an elected legislator. That's what they did in Colorado, GAVEL. And they have these rules in place. That's how they got to 100% fairness score.
Here's what I know. This process is broken. If you need any greater testament, look at what will happen by 11 a.m. today. Or if we're lucky, we'll get it recessed and we'll come back for 15 minutes later this afternoon. And we will do to the Pennsylvania Constitution what the majority sees fit in what is being called a transparent and accountable process. The minority will have never had an opportunity to review the bill. The people will never have had a hearing. The folks that are in the hallway that are unable to come in will never able to even see the process go down. It is not worthy of the process. I know that in the legislature, we require local governments to take public comment. We don't do that for ourselves. So just understand, the legislature takes a different view.
If you spent time in our state house watching how our bills are handled, you have seen the many tactics used to shut down reform and ensure the status quo. Power is addictive, and those with power focus great attention on ways to maintain that power while doing all they can to discourage attention from citizens like us, determined to see the system change.
The fact that we have 2 representatives that held this up so the people could not vote on it is just mind-blowing in this democracy, in any democracy.
It's unconscionable.
Yes.
We, Fair Districts PA, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, Common Cause PA, Committee of 70, Represent Pennsylvania, March on Harrisburg, dozens of other organizations, and thousands of volunteers across the state, we are working together to reclaim our democracy and to restore representative governance that serves us all well.
You can have all the rules you want, but unless you have a spirit amongst the leadership that they're going to abide by the spirit of those rules, it's sometimes an uphill battle.
I've been at many rallies here in the Capitol. There have been some rallies that filled up the first floor. There have been a few that had people on the second floor. I don't know if I've ever been at a rally where folks were up on the 4th floor lending their voice.
Gerrymandering undermines accountable government, and we are gathered here to make clear that that must change.
The people have the right to alter and reform. The people have the right to alter and reform.
Find out the latest about legislative strategy and how you can help at fairdistrictspa.com and sign the petition for change.